Thank you, David. Now, as we move from Thanksgiving emphasis to Christmas emphasis, I'm going to begin a series today that will lead up to the Christmas holiday, talking about the reasons why Jesus came into this world. Have you ever stopped and asked that question? Why was Jesus born in Bethlehem all those years ago? For what purpose did he come into this world? And of course, Pastor Lynette mentioned a little while ago the answer that we always give as Christians, right? And it's the right answer. It's the good answer, that Jesus came to die for the sins of the world, to provide salvation, to make reconciliation with God possible through grace. And we're certainly going to touch upon that one on the Sunday before Christmas. We're going to save the big one, for last. But there are other purposes, as you read through the New Testament, that Jesus gives as to why he came. His primary purpose was to come and bring salvation to us, but in the process, there were also some other tasks that he set before himself, other parts of his mission that he wanted to accomplish. And we're going to talk about several of those over these next 5 weeks or so. And the one we're going to talk about today is the fact that Jesus came to set free those who are oppressed. And of course we can apply that spiritually, because all of us were oppressed by sin, and God brings deliverance through the grace of Jesus Christ. But there's other kinds of oppression too that we see. It can be emotional, it can be addiction, it can be physical abuse of some kind, it could be some type of even brokenheartedness that Jesus is going to talk about in the scripture we're about to read. All kinds of things that we need released from. But also, what we're going to emphasize today is our need as the church to value and to reach out to those who are oppressed. And so that's going to be a part of our theme this morning too. So let's pick it up in Luke chapter 4, beginning at verse 14. We'll go down through verse 21. It says that Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and news of him went out through all the surrounding region, and he taught in their synagogues, being glorified by all. So he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah, and when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written. And this is our key verse for the day. Jesus is speaking, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." And then he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all who were in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." It's been all the rage over the last couple of decades for various organizations, whether secular or religious, to develop a mission statement. Generally, it's one sentence that declares that organization's purpose, why they exist. I saw a cartoon some time back that showed these two businessmen in a meeting room, and on the board was just the one word, whatever. Okay, just that one word, whatever. And the one businessman says to the newbie, he says, "That's our new mission statement. We wrote it on the day that we switched to decaf." I can just see them all sitting around the table without their caffeine, saying, whatever. Well, Jesus laid out his mission in his very first sermon. He gave us his mission statement right here in Luke chapter 4 and verse 18. When he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, and to preach deliverance to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed." Now I want you to think about the 5 groups of people that Jesus mentioned in verse 18. He mentioned the poor, the brokenhearted, the captives, the blind, and the oppressed. The King James says the bruised on that last one. And you think about those groups, and what do they all have in common? They're all the downtrodden, the beaten down, the marginalized, the outcasts, those who may not have a voice, those who are often down and out. And these are the ones that Jesus said he came to minister to. Now, certainly he ministers to all, and he loves all. But he came to be a voice for those who didn't seem to have one. You see, it's important to understand that in Jewish society, Israel was the home to a number of groups of people that were marginalized, that were neglected, looked down upon. They had no status, and often they had no rights, no representation, and no consideration. This would include children, women, the poor, the sick, the uneducated, non-Jewish people, tax collectors, and basically anyone that they deemed to be, quote unquote, sinful. In other words, anyone who was not an educated Jewish man was considered to be unimportant. Now think about Jesus' ministry. Who did he spend the majority of his time hanging out with and ministering to? The poor, the sick. He brought the children to him and sat them in his midst. He had women who supported his ministry. It was often these who were down and out. He knew that the respectable people in the Jewish society was not going to pay them any mind. And he did. Because Jesus, to him, there was no such thing as an unimportant person. In fact, Jesus lifted them so much that he even made some of them, take Matthew, for example, the hated tax collector, some of his closest and most trusted followers. Jesus gave this group a voice. Jesus took these who were outcasts, these who were downtrodden, these that people would look at and snarl at, that people would look at and say they're disgusting or they have no value, and he would lift them up. And I want to make a couple of statements about those who are oppressed, those who are neglected, marginalized, cast-offs from Jesus' ministry, to see how we ourselves need to look at those in our world who may not have a voice, who may not be considered of worth in our society even today, these 2,000 years later. The first statement is this, that those who are oppressed are highly valued in the eyes of God. Those who are oppressed, those who are downtrodden, are highly valued in the eyes of God. Now maybe you're sitting there and saying, well, what do you base that on? Well, I base it on the Scriptures. If you just survey the Scriptures, you'll see that God places a tremendous emphasis on those who are outcasts, those who may not have the strength or the ability in themselves to make themselves a place. In the very early parts of Exodus, when God hears the cries of his own people down in Egypt, he sends Moses to bring deliverance to them out of the hand of the Egyptians and bring them freedom. God is always championing the cause of those who are downtrodden to bring about justice and equality. One of the laws of the Old Testament is when the people harvested the fields, that whatever was dropped or left behind, that they weren't to go back and gather it. They were to leave it. You remember why? For the poor. They said, don't go back. You know, that would be our tendency, right? Go back, get it all. And he would say, leave it. So that the poor could come along and gather what was left behind. That was one of the ways God provided for those who were less fortunate, because he was looking out for them. And in the New Testament, God calls a peasant girl by the name of Mary, a peasant girl. You would think he would have chosen someone elite, someone who had a place in their culture. But no, he chooses a poor girl named Mary to birth the Messiah, the Savior of the world. God highly values those that much of society often casts off. You know what's been really hard to witness, and maybe you've seen this at times too, is that even in the church, down through the years of ministry, I've heard of examples and seen examples of churches that have tried to reach out to groups of people who much of culture would neglect. And often the church's response has not been positive. For example, a church might reach out into the projects or into the trailer parks and maybe bring kids in for special events or just for every Sunday, you know. And sometimes churches have responded with very poor attitudes. I've heard it said where even churches have said, why are we reaching out to them? Why are you bothering? They're loud. They create chaos. They tear up stuff in the church. And really, what they're really saying is they're not worth it. They're not worth the trouble. They're of no value, is really the message that's being sent. Why do we go after people that make us feel more comfortable, or people that are more, well, they have it all together, you know, the ones that don't make us sacrifice? Maybe the ones that can contribute more, whether financially or through their service or their influence. Why bother with these that really have nothing to offer? They're just a lot of work. And that's really been the message. And many churches have responded this way, much to our shame. And when I hear stories like that, I think, God, have mercy on us. God, forgive us. For how can we, his children, have a heart that's so far away from the heart that God possesses, who highly values these people whom we might call of low degree? I mean, it's heartbreaking. And the church has a poor history of its response toward the poor and to the sick and the downtrodden. I'm not speaking, I haven't heard that here, in case you're wondering. Is he saying that because of something he's heard here? But it's been a part of the history of the church. I'm talking about particularly in the United States. And I'm not talking outside the Church of God as well as inside. We need to do something about that. And you ever thought about the fact that, what if Jesus attended here? And what if Jesus was in charge of our evangelism program? And what if Jesus started inviting people to church? Did you ever stop and think who Jesus might invite? Imagine sitting up here near the front as a man who's known throughout town as a thief and a swindler. Why, he'll take you for everything you got, and he won't feel any shame about it. He's hated by almost everybody. He might be seated right up here because Jesus invited him. Next to him sits a man who they say just a week ago was running around almost naked in the cemeteries among the tombstones. He was cutting himself and screaming like a madman. Jesus invited him to church, and he's sitting down here next to that swindler. And next to him sits this woman who's dressed, well, she's very gaudy, tasteless. She could use a lesson in good taste, you know. I don't want to gossip, but they say just last week she was caught in the very act of adultery. And Jesus had to protect her from a mob. And he said, let him who was without sin among you cast the first stone. Jesus protected her. Well, she's here too. Sitting right next to the swindler and the madman. And do we realize that these are the kinds of people that Jesus ministered to? The ones that when we see, well, we just want to kind of pretend we don't notice them and we go on our way. We don't want anything to do with them. They make us feel uncomfortable. Or maybe we think they're just not valuable. And yet Jesus died for them just like he died for you. And just like he died for me. Let me give you a little test here. Let's suppose this morning or next Sunday morning, man walks into our west entrance. And maybe he's an influential leader here in Sapulpa. Maybe it's the mayor. Maybe it's the head of a major organization. He's dressed nice. Every hair is in place. He's a respectable individual. And at about the same time, a man walks into our east door. His jeans are a little too long, and he's got holes in his sneakers. Got dirt on his pants. His flannel shirt's untucked. His hair hadn't been washed in days, weeks. His beard's all unkempt, scruffy. And you're walking toward our foyer, and you see both of them come in. Who do you run to? What's your inclination? You look to your right, you look to your left. Do you run to the nicely dressed man and say, well, welcome, it's good to see you this morning. Glad to have you. Because we don't feel too comfortable with the other. In case you're wondering if I'm just making this scenario up, it's found in James chapter 2. It'd be a good idea to read it, just for their first 13 verses. Because James said, suppose there walks into your church a nicely dressed man in good apparel, with a gold ring on his finger, and there comes in a poor man in vile raiment, and you have respect to him, honor to him, who's in the nice clothing, and you bring him up and you put him in the choice seat. And you say to the other man, I'll just sit over there wherever you find. Whatever. We don't care. He says, are you not being a judge of persons? A respecter of persons? Aren't we saying in this case, well, we value this gentleman. I mean, he looks nice. He plays the part well. He would fit right in here. We like people like that. But these others, we could discard them. We don't need them around. It's tough, isn't it? I mean, we deal with this. All of us struggle with this. At least we have to think about it. How are we going to respond? And I don't think we'll ever respond with the love of Jesus unless we really have the love of Jesus for all individuals in our hearts. Because a natural tendency is for people to look at others who maybe are on a lower stratosphere, or lower economic level, or a lower level of maybe sophistication, and say, well, they just don't measure up. And we need to do some heart searching, don't we? All of us, myself included. And say, Lord, let the love of Jesus live in my heart and see that every individual is of value. You know what's really humbling is to stop and say, you know what, there are people higher than I am who probably look at me and say, what a bum. That'll humble you. Because we don't really have it all together like we think we do, if we're really honest. God values, and when you think about how much God values every person, that will fill our hearts with love, to realize he values everybody. And he picked me up when I was dirty and filthy in sin, and same with you, and lifted you up. So the least we can do is show love to others. The second main statement I want to share is that those who are oppressed find deliverance by the hand of God. God delivers from sin, first of all, and he came to set the captives free, which I was and you were. We were all captive by sin. He came to deliver us and bring freedom and hope to us. He alone can deliver us from addiction. He alone can deliver us from the pains and scars of our past. Only God can do that. God can deliver us from all these things, and God came to set us free from all these things. He also came to set others free. And when we look at somebody who's maybe just controlled by alcohol or drugs, to believe and to know that God can bring deliverance to them. There have been many a drunkard and many a prostitute and many a druggie who's been delivered by the hand of God to salvation. There are stories which prove the grace of God. And his deliverance is remarkable. He can do what only he can do. I want to tell a little extended story to illustrate this point and how we ought to respond in the love of God. This is a story that Tony Campolo told in one of his books. Tony Campolo, if you don't know who he is, he's in his 80s now. He's a former pastor, former professor, sociologist at a university in Pennsylvania. And he talks about a time when he traveled to Hawaii, which he sometimes did for his work and probably sometimes just for leisure. But he was out there by himself one time, and he was talking about how the time difference, I think it was 6 hours at that particular time because of the time zones and time change and all that. And he said because of that, when it's 2:30 in the morning in Honolulu, my biological clock, he says, tells me that it's 8:30 in the morning. 6-hour difference. And so he says that is why I sometimes find myself awake in the middle of the night in Honolulu. And not only am I awake, but I'm also ready for breakfast. And so that explains why I was out on the streets of Honolulu one morning at 2:30 a.m. looking for some place to eat. And as you might imagine, it's very difficult to find something to eat at 2:30 in the morning. But as it approached 3 o'clock, he went down this one side street and he found a small diner that was open. And he walked in, he sat on the stool at the counter. And this big burly guy came up to him and said, "What do you want?" Kind of like that, Now, Tony Campolo said this was your typical greasy spoon. He said, "I didn't even want to pick up the menu because I was afraid something might crawl out." That kind of place. And Tony Campolo said, "I'll have a cup of coffee and a donut." Now, Campolo said, I'm a realist. I understand into the back of some of these places, those donuts probably get knocked on the floor and kicked around and everything. But at least out front, I wish he would have just wiped his hand on his greasy apron and just picked up a donut and given it to me. I wish at least he would have used some tongs or something. But he said it was the only place to eat, so I was going to take it. So he's sitting there, eating his donut, drinking his coffee. And 3:30 a.m., the door opens. And about 8 or 9 boisterous, provocatively dressed prostitutes walk into the diner. It's a small place. 4 or 5 of them sat on one side, the other sat on the other side of where Tony was sitting. And they were loud and they were crude in their talk, as you can imagine. And Tony said he felt very uncomfortable and he started to try to figure out a way he could leave fairly soon. He's about to gather up his stuff when the girl seated next to him just says, "Tomorrow's my birthday. I'll be 39 years old." And one of the girls on the other side, supposedly a friend, right, says, "Well, what do you want us to do about it? So it's your birthday. Big deal. You want us to throw you a party or something, get you a cake? It ain't happening." And this one girl says, "Gee, you don't have to be so mean about it. I was just saying it was my birthday, that's all. I didn't expect you to do anything for me. Don't expect a cake or party. I've never had a birthday ever in my life, not a birthday party. So why would I expect one now?" And when she said that she had never had a birthday party, Tony Campolo got an idea. He waited till all the girls left. And he said to the guy behind the counter, Harry was his name. He said, "Hey, Harry," he said, "do those girls come in here every night at 3:30? And he said, "Yeah, about every night." He said, "That girl that was seated next to me, is she always here with them every night at 3:30? And he goes, "Yeah, that's Agnes. Yeah, Agnes is always with them." And Tony said, "Well, what would you think if tomorrow night we have a big birthday party for Agnes?" And for the first time, that big burly guy behind the counter smiled. He said, "Man, that's a great idea. That'd be awesome." And he hollered, his wife was in the back, and he hollered for her to come out. And, "Hey, this guy's got a great idea. He wants to have a birthday party for Agnes tomorrow night." And she said, "Oh, that'd be great. She's so nice, but nobody ever does anything for her. And I think it's a great idea." So Tony Campolo says, "Well, I'll tell you what, I'll be here tomorrow at 2:30 in the morning. And I'll have some decorations, I'll get a cake, everything." And Harry said, "Oh no," he said, "the cake's my thing. I'll get the cake, I'll do the cake, I'll make one, you do the rest." And so, okay, so 2:30 in the morning, the next morning, Tony Campolo's there. He had a banner made that said, "Happy Birthday, Agnes." He bought decorations and decorated that diner from one end to the other, and it was looking good. Well, apparently, Harry's wife had gotten word out on the streets about this party. And Tony Campolo said it seemed like every prostitute in Honolulu was in that diner that night. He said by 3:15 it was like wall-to-wall prostitutes and me. And 3:30 comes around. And he was kind of the MC of the whole thing, you know. So when Agnes walked in, he had all of them say, "Happy birthday!" And Tony Campolo said he had never seen anyone so flabbergasted, so stunned in his whole life. She stood there with her mouth hanging open. Her knees were getting weak beneath her. One of her friends kind of steadied her, you know, and kind of walked her over to the stool at the counter. They were singing "Happy Birthday to You." And her eyes were getting all moist, you know. Well, then Harry comes out with the cake, and then she just lost it. Agnes just started crying uncontrollably. They're finishing up the song, and Harry says, "Blow out the candles, Agnes. Blow them out. If you don't blow them out, I will." And she was still kind of crying, you know, so Harry blew them out. And then he handed her some knife, you know, and said, "Cut the cake, Agnes, cut the cake." And she was looking at the cake, and she didn't even look up. She said, "Harry, if it's okay, I mean, if you don't mind, if it's okay with everybody, and nobody cares, well, here, I mean, if it's all right, could we maybe just not eat the cake right now?" And Harry was like, "Well, sure, Agnes, we don't have to cut it now. I mean, you can have the cake. Take it home if you want." And she looked over at Tony and said, "Can I?" She said, "Look, my mom and I, we just live a couple of doors down. And I'd love to just take this cake home and show my mom." And he said, "Sure." And so Agnes picks up the cake and she's walking toward the exit. And he said she's carrying it like she's carrying the Holy Grail. You know, like she's protecting it for all it's worth. And she walked out the door, and Tony Campolo said it was like stunned silence in the diner. Because she was gone, you know. And he really didn't know what to do, so he says, "Why don't we all pray?" He said, "I don't know why I said it. I mean, we're at 3:30 in the morning in a diner in Honolulu, and I'm leading all these prostitutes in a prayer. It just seemed like the right thing to do." And so he prayed for Agnes. He prayed for her well-being and for her salvation. And when he got done, you know, Harry, you know, the big guy behind the counter, comes over, and he says to Tony, "Hey, you didn't tell me you were a preacher. So what kind of church do you belong to?" And Tony Campolo said it was just one of those times when the right words came. He said, "I belong to the type of church that throws birthday parties for prostitutes in Honolulu at 3:30 in the morning." And Harry said, "No way. There aren't any churches like that. Because if there was, I'd join it." He said, "I'd join a church like that." I don't know how you feel about that story. But I'm not so sure that the church that Jesus came to create isn't too far from that. I don't know where along the lines in the history of church that we got to where we have to be so prim and proper. And that we said that everyone has to clean themselves up first before they come to the Lord's house. I don't know where that happened. But you wouldn't believe how many times I've heard people say, "Well, I'll come to church if I can find something to wear." Or, I'd be there, but I'd stick out like a sore thumb because I don't have a suit. Or I don't have the right dress or the right clothes. What they're basically saying is, I just don't know if I could come because I don't fit in. I don't have it all together. I don't find any verse in the Bible that says you have to have it all together before the church will minister to you. If you can show me that verse, do it. But I don't think it's there. I pray for God to work on my heart, because I think, we're all typical and honest. This is probably something we all deal with, Everybody talks about racism, and that's a big issue. But I think sometimes, I don't know what the word is for it, but classism, if you want to say, this feeling of elitist mentality that we have in the church, that we're kind of a notch above those who are poor and sick and kind of out of touch, or just don't have it all together, uneducated, however you want to say it. Let God do a new work in us, to see the value that God places on all people. And before you say, well, but it's a reach down to minister to them. Well, there's pride there, first of all. But secondly, think about how far God had to reach down for me and for you. He's God. We're merely humans. At least others are human. And if we're saying we have to reach down, there's elitist attitudes right there. Because we're all the same. We're all the same. We're all human beings. Maybe you have an intelligence that this brother or sister over here may not have. Maybe you have money that somebody else doesn't have. Maybe your family is very well adjusted and well accepted in society, and somebody else is very dysfunctional. Does that make them of any less value than what you are? Of course not. We're all of value. Some of us, maybe, some of you, some of all of us, maybe even blessed more than others in certain ways. But no one is to be discarded. All is to be loved. Let's stand together as we pray.